Greetings all and welcome to part 7 and final episode of my analysis of the movie Fight Club. As we left off last time, Tyler Durden had tapped into the repressed anger in the men of Fight Club and had misdirected it, pointing the aggression toward consumer society. Interestingly, some of you long-term followers may remember a video I did 7 years ago titled How to Build a Male Bomb. Note that is M-A-L-E, not M-A-I-L. I've linked that video below if you're interested, and I think it's probably worth a listen in conjunction with this series. But for the abbreviated review, the point I was making in that video is that if you take a society of fatherless men, disenfranchise them, demonize them, marginalize them, you are asking for big, big trouble. And what I think is particularly germane to this conversation is that I postulated that the collective outrage and potential violence wasn't going to be a product of MRAs or MGTOW. It would be the men who never had the intellectual and emotional refuge of red pill thinking who were most at risk to become violent and destructive, and that they would most likely not even have a clue as to what was driving their rage. I'd like to say that my dedicating a talk to this 7 years ago was smart, even prophetic on my part, but it's not exactly rocket science to say that if you put a dog in a corner and kick it long enough, it will eventually come out snarling and biting. I say that in the full belief that a Fight Club male bomb scenario has already come to fruition. It's called Antifa. And I feel comfortable in predicting that it will take on many other forms and names in this continually deteriorating society. Angry fatherless men with dismal prospects have immersed themselves in the identity of perpetual aggrievement and are lashing out violently in a pathetic attempt to set the world right when they don't even know what a righted world looks like. And just as I predicted, they are not red pill men. They are the throwaway children of the gender war, the walking wounded, irrationally and defensively lashing out at all the wrong things for all the wrong reasons. So too are the fictional men of Fight Club. The movie script has told us this in no uncertain terms. From this point forward, I'm going to push toward the end by covering 2 subplots. There is story A, the narrator's continuing struggle with his feelings for Marla, and story B, the accelerated development of Fight Club into an army, complete with shaved heads, black uniforms, and the willingness to die for whatever reason Tyler Durden gives them. To start with the latter, the men of Fight Club begin to show up at the house on Paper Street for what amounts to basic training. We see them arriving only to be stopped at the door and deprived of food, water, and shelter for 3 days before being admitted. While on the porch, they are berated and physically abused by Tyler and by the narrator, who continues to emulate Tyler in his conscious life. Now, I'm sure to the die-hard believers that Tyler is red pill and simply testing the mettle and dedication of these men, that the more objective look will find quick comparison to cults and to the military, which are near synonymous in my estimation. For total obedience, you wear a man down till he breaks, then rebuild him into the image needed to fight for whatever agenda is at play. The narrator says this with magnificent accuracy as he watches the recruits going through the abuse. Sooner or later, he says, we all became what Tyler wanted us to be. In another particularly cogent scene, patently reminiscent of an Orwellian re-education camp, the men are set to working like drones as Tyler lords over them, blasting them with propaganda through a megaphone. You are not special, he announces. You are not a beautiful and unique snowflake. You're the same decaying organic matter as everyone else. We're all singing, all dancing crap of the world. We're all part of the same compost heap. It's an interesting drumbeat of brainwashing, especially given that Tyler is creating an army of said snowflakes, and totally disposable ones at that. The narrator issues a subtle questioning of Tyler's motives. Why was Tyler building an army, he asks. To what purpose? For what greater good? In Tyler, we trusted. Like I said, snowflakes. Violent, mindless, disposable snowflakes. Obedient to the point of dying for a cause they did not understand, for an agenda they did not create. If anyone thinks this is a red pill path, I suggest testing for color blindness. And this sets up what will become the emergent conflict, the struggle for control between the narrator and his shadow. The Snowflake Army, under Tyler's direction, has initiated Project Mayhem. Unaware of this, the narrator is aghast that the men have firebombed a building. He demands that the men tell him what's happened. The response comes from Robert Paulson, whose enlarged breasts have now been conspicuously concealed from the audience. Sir, the first rule of Project Mayhem is that you don't ask questions. Well, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to translate that line. Sir, the first rule of the shadow taking control is that you keep the host in the dark. And gents, this is how our shadow, useful to draw on in conscious, limited ways, becomes an agent of our destruction when we abdicate control. This is the hapless struggle of the narrator, living in denial of his legitimate red pill rage. Unable to process it, to grieve and move on, he simply remains disconnected, denying responsibility as his shadow, his anima, moves toward killing him and all the men around him. And the men, brainwashed and servile, do not notice. They are too busy fetching him beer, calling him sir, idolizing him as a blue pill alpha. It's also important here to refer to Story A. As the narrator has become somewhat uncomfortable with Tyler, he is warming up to Marla. He's begun to treat her with less disdain and attempts to engage her in what blue pill men would call meaningful conversation. And this, of course, is where the blue pill conjurers of this story reveal their ignorance of the very narrative they have authored. Their intent is simple and transparent. As the narrator begins to question Tyler's motives, as he begins just the slightest to move away from his influence, he moves toward a connection with a woman. It's a black and white message that as the narrator's maturation and personal development improve, as he begins to wrest the slightest control away from his shadow, that improved state allows him more meaningful connection with a woman. That the woman is a conniving manipulator, a substance-abusing thief, and slovenly barfly isn't of consequence. As with real-life blue pill men, the only qualifications needed is that she is female and that she reciprocates his attraction. It's the same formula of every two-bit romantic comedy ever produced in the gynocentric cesspool of Hollywood. Immature, worthless man meets woman and resists her feminine wisdom, proving his idiocy until the message finally sinks in and he proves his worth by committing to her. What we see here is the narrator starting to resist Tyler's blue pill path of mindless self-destruction, moving directly to another blue pill path of mindless self-destruction, masquerading as the enlightened and redeeming love of a woman. But this too sparks dissonance and confusion in the narrator. In the next scene, he fights a young blonde man, very attractive in a Gucci advertising sort of way, and pummels him savagely. The scene is absolutely bloody and disturbing, and, being the narrator, he narrates his thoughts as he delivers one vicious blow after another. I felt like putting a bullet between the eyes of every panda who wouldn't screw to save its species, he says. I wanted to open the dump valves on oil tankers and smother all those French beaches I'd never see. I wanted to breathe smoke. This scant bit of self-dialogue is very revealing. I felt like putting a bullet between the eyes of every panda who wouldn't screw to save its species. Now, obviously, this is a healthy dose of projection. Throughout the movie, it is the narrator who won't screw, who cannot even admit that he wants to. And it is the one part of him that with even a modicum of deeper understanding would have served a red pill plot. The narrator could have rejected Marla completely, or he could have done the pump and dump, and he might have ushered himself into a truer autonomy. It was the one and only door to red pill redemption, and he slammed it closed in a bloody, self-loathing frenzy. And of course, true to the unclaimed, unconscious intent of the narrative, his blue pill rage leads him to echo a tacit endorsement of Project Mayhem, ready to destroy anything for the simple sake of having destroyed. The narrator has again shied away from confronting his sexual and emotional isolation and the real causes of his being led there. He is trapped in a personal no man's land, caught between his lifelong fears and surrendering them to his shadow. Unwilling to settle for the standoff, Tyler pushes back against the narrator in one of the more iconic scenes from the movie. With Tyler at the wheel in a car racing down a rain-soaked highway, the narrator confronts Tyler about Project Mayhem, and more specifically, about his lack of inclusion in the plans. Metaphorically speaking, of course, the narrator is challenging Tyler for control of his life. It's his first real attempt to do so, and Tyler fights back by letting go of the wheel and telling the narrator that he must let go of any notion of control, which of course is a metaphor for surrendering control to his shadow. As if to enlighten the narrator on the importance of finding purpose in such a surrender, and while the car is edging its way off the pavement and onto the shoulder, Tyler asks the two Project Mayhem soldiers in the back seat what they wish to do before they die. One says he wants to paint a self-portrait, the other to build a house. They answer crisply and instantly, as though certain of who they are and what they want. There's one catch, though. The soldiers are not painting portraits or building houses. They aren't doing anything at all about the things of which they appear to be so certain and secure. Their answers might as well have come after yanking on pull cords at the back of their necks, because what they are doing, as opposed to what they are saying, is blindly following a blue pill madman ready to perish at his whim. And indeed, Tyler allows the car to run off the road, hitting a car on the shoulder and flipping violently into the ditch. Now, I'm sure this scene could be interpreted in a number of ways. There are certainly enough holes in the plot to allow for that. One interpretation is that the soldiers knew who they were and were prepared to die for it. That makes little sense to me, though, since people who know with certainty who they are and what they want don't tend to say one thing and do another. Knowing that leaves me to rely on Occam's razor. The scene says to me what every other scene in the movie says with regularity and crystal clarity. Trust your shadow to run your life and you end up in a ditch, which is precisely where the narrator found himself by refusing to take the wheel away from Tyler. Immediately after the crash, and by no means coincidentally, the narrator wakes to find that Tyler's gone. He is quickly pulled under by the depression that defined him at the very start of our story. And in that sinkhole of despair, he again gives us an affirmation of the message behind the message that has guided us all the way through this film. I am all alone, he says. My father dumped me. Tyler dumped me. I am Jack's broken heart. Not I'm resentful because I'm not a rock star, not some spiel about aggrieved entitlement or lost privilege, but the deep wounding that is ever the legacy of the absent father. And sadly, with no insight as to how to move past this same fundamental problem that even the movie makers could barely allude to. Our poor, miserable narrator is at the mercy of writers who really don't understand who he is. But his suffering at the moment will have to take a backseat to yet another crisis when Robert is brought in with half of his head blown off. In yet another memorable scene from the movie, we discover that Tyler, the supposedly red pill Tyler, has instructed the members of Project Mayhem that none of them are allowed any longer to have names. Tyler has orchestrated a collective consciousness for the group. Nameless, disposable, biodegradable components of the same compost. Void of individuality, they serve the anima's purpose through a decidedly feminine hive mind. I cannot even venture to speculate the mental gymnastics required to interpret all this as some sort of noble red pill initiative. The narrator, stricken with grief over the loss of his friend, chastises the group and challenges their view of him as a replaceable cog in Tyler's insane machine. His name is Robert Paulson, he says, and true to the blue pill brainwashing, this is interpreted differently than the narrator's intent. I understand, one of the men chimes in. In death, a member of Project Mayhem has a name. His name is Robert Paulson. And as if on cue, the others join the chorus, chanting the phrase like a mantra. His name is Robert Paulson. 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 At this point, I'm amazed that I ever thought of the Fight Club members or Tyler Durden as red pill renegades, but I did. In taking the closer look at this film, I think I've come to understand it much better and have realized that I was woefully wrong. This movie isn't red pill. It doesn't even present the audience with a red pill option, as we will see clearly illustrated in the ending. After some necessary twists and turns in the storyline to show us that the narrator is figuring out that he is Tyler Durden, and the unnecessary and superfluous fact that Project Mayhem is going to blow up a bunch of credit card companies, with the wholly unrealistic result of wiping out the debt record, we come to the final scene. With the explosive set to go off in seconds, the narrator concludes that to get rid of Tyler, he has to turn a gun on himself, shooting himself through the cheek from the inside out. This was literally disappointing, unimaginative, and thoroughly lacking plausibility in my book, but the point was made that in order to rid himself of Tyler's influence, the narrator had to eject him with extreme prejudice. He had to take command of the situation and act in his own self-interest without hesitation, even if it came at great cost. That alone had a potential for a useful, if not happy, ending. But any possible red pill moral to this story was destroyed as we see the narrator taking Marla's hand, just as the bombs detonate and the buildings start to implode. For me, it was an infuriating ending. The narrator breaks and his personality fractured. After drawing enough strength courtesy of his shadow, he wrests control of his life back, only to show us that all these lessons, all the challenges and the prices paid, his swan song is to take Marla's hand as the buildings go down. He has rid himself of the toxic effects of his anima, only to take the lesson as enough personal maturity to allow him to bond with the worst example of femininity ever played on screen. The narrator has grown up enough to have a meaningful relationship with a meaningless woman. The subtext, of course, being that even a female pile of garbage is better than no female at all. This was a disappointing end for sure, a story of a man who escapes one circle of hell only to enter another. On the high note, though, there's a lot to take from this film. There are red pill lessons aplenty if you're willing to wade through the obfuscations of the blue pill makers. They seemed intent on making sure the worthy values contained in the narrative were as difficult as possible to get to. I'm pretty certain, though, that that was not their intent. It was just them not knowing any better. Every good story has a good moral, though, even if it is cryptic and hard to see. And Fight Club is a good story. It's a film that chronicles the transformative power of the shadow, teaching us that there are parts of ourselves that are quite valuable in moderation, but utterly dangerous if we lean on them too heavily. Fight Club is also a great, if unintended, statement about the pervasive devastation that nobody talks about: the absence of fathers. There are a number of other morals contained in the film, but it is not my role here to tell you what you were supposed to get out of it. I do hope, however, that listening to this series has inspired you to think about how the consideration of narrative can be useful when applied to your own life on the terms you choose for yourself. If I've helped anyone with that, it was worth the effort to do all 7 parts. And with that, I will conclude this part and the series. Also, let me take this moment to ask you to consider visiting my Patreon page linked below and making a small pledge. I am starting to near my goal of 300 patrons, as I am sitting right now with 236, for which I am most grateful. As it says on my Patreon page, when we get to the goal of 300, we'll band together like Spartans and inflict sanity on the world. Of course, we'll all be slaughtered. But that's another movie, and it's time for me to go. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, even if you haven't, and we'll see you next time.